No one ever expected this. Rick Harrison, the man millions watched on their TV screens for years, suddenly found himself in a dark, cold prison cell. The same Rick who ran a successful pawn shop, smiled in front of the cameras, made smart deals, and became one of the most well-known faces of reality television. He was a fan favorite on Pawn Stars, a businessman, a father, and a man who seemed to have it all. But something happened, something no one saw coming. Now people are asking the same question: how did Rick Harrison go from being a TV star to living behind bars? At first the news didn't seem real. Social media was full of shocked comments. Is this a joke? Rick Harrison? In prison? That can't be true. But it was true. The man who once stood confidently behind the counter of the gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas now wore an orange jumpsuit. The change was quick and the reasons were not fully clear at first. The media gave little bits and pieces of the story, but no one knew the full truth. This made people even more curious. Everyone wanted to know what went wrong in Rick's life. Some said it was a business deal gone bad. Others whispered about money issues or legal problems that had been kept hidden for years. There were also rumors that Rick had been dealing with personal struggles, stress, pressure, and health problems that the cameras never showed. But none of this was confirmed. What was confirmed, though, was that Rick Harrison was now in prison, and it shocked everyone. Rick always appeared calm, smart, and in control. On Pawn Stars, he handled crazy situations every day. Angry customers, rare items, and tough negotiations were part of his normal life. He always knew how to keep things cool and make a profit. People admired his confidence and knowledge. That's why it was so hard to imagine him in a prison cell. What could have happened that led him to this point? Did he make a mistake? Was he in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was there something darker going on that no one ever knew about? As fans waited for answers, curiosity kept growing. The image of Rick behind bars didn't match the Rick they knew. Some people felt sorry for him. Others were angry, thinking he had fooled them all these years. But no one had all the facts. That's what made the situation so mysterious. Everyone wanted to know what Rick was going through. Was he okay? Was he scared? Did he feel regret? And most of all, would he ever be the same again? For someone like Rick, who lived under the public eye for so long, falling from fame was not just a personal loss, it was a public one. The world was watching. Every move he made, every expression on his face, every word he said was being judged. That's the price of fame. One mistake, and everything can change. And for Rick, everything did. Imagine being in his shoes. One day you're on TV, signing autographs, smiling with fans. The next day you're alone in a small room with steel bars and no privacy. No cameras to protect you, no team to clean up your mess. Just silence, cold walls, and your own thoughts. For someone who was once surrounded by people, the loneliness must have been heavy. For someone who once made deals worth thousands of dollars, now every moment was a struggle. People began to wonder about Rick's mental state. How was he handling this? Was he staying strong, or was he breaking down? Those questions led to even more curiosity. People started digging deeper, looking for signs from before his arrest, interviews, public appearances, anything that could explain how this all started. Some clips showed him looking tired. Others showed him avoiding questions or getting upset easily. Maybe the signs were always there, and no one noticed. One thing was certain: Rick's life would never be the same. Whether he was guilty or innocent, the experience of being in prison would leave a mark on him. It would change how people saw him, how he saw himself, and maybe even how he lived the rest of his life. Fame is powerful, but when it fades, reality can hit hard. And in Rick's case, it hit harder than anyone expected. People still don't know the full story, and maybe they never will. But that's what keeps them watching, reading, and wondering. There's something about a fall from fame that grabs attention. It reminds people that no one is perfect, not even the stars they admire. Rick's story is still unfolding, and until all the facts come out, people will keep guessing, keep talking, and keep asking the same question: how did it all go so wrong? This fall from fame wasn't just a simple mistake, it was something bigger, something deeper. And now, with Rick Harrison behind bars, the world waits for answers. Some want justice, some want truth, and some just want to know if the Rick they saw on TV was ever real to begin with. It was the first night. The doors closed behind him with a loud sound, and Rick Harrison stood there, trying to understand what had just happened. A man who used to walk freely through his famous pawn shop was now locked inside a small space with nothing familiar around him. The lights were harsh, the smell was strange, and the coldness of the walls made it clear that this place was nothing like the world he came from. Rick's mind was full of questions. How did I get here? What happens next? Will I survive this? He looked around the prison. There were no gold coins, no old books, No rare items. Just people he didn't know. And a silence that made his heart beat louder. For the first time in a long time, Rick had no control over his situation. This was not TV. This was real. People stared at him. Some recognized his face from television. A few even whispered his name. Rick could feel their eyes following him as he walked through the hallway in his new prison clothes. It was strange. Usually when people looked at him, it was with admiration or curiosity about the items he sold. Now it was different. There was no respect in their eyes. Only interest, and different kind of curiosity. What was a celebrity doing here? Would he act like a big shot? Would he survive? His cell was small and had just the basics. A metal bed, a thin mattress, and a toilet in the corner. There was no comfort. There was no privacy. Rick sat on the bed and looked down at the floor. He had never felt this lonely before. Outside the walls of his pawn shop, he had cameras, customers, fans, and his family. Inside this cell, there was only silence and time. The first night was the hardest. Rick didn't sleep much. Every small noise made him jump. The sounds of footsteps, voices, and metal doors closing echoed all around. He kept thinking about his sons, his business, and what people must be saying about him. Were they disappointed? Were they defending him? Or were they already moving on? The next day started early. Rick had to wake up when the guards said so. There was no choice, no personal schedule. Everything was controlled. Breakfast was given, not chosen. It was nothing like what he used to eat at home, or during breaks on his show. The food was cold and tasteless, but he ate it because he had to. He was then taken for orientation, where he was told the rules of prison life. No special treatment. No excuses. Everyone was the same inside. For Rick that was a shock. He had lived most of his life as someone who had attention and some power. Here he was just another inmate. He had to learn quickly how things worked. As the days went by, Rick started to see just how different prison life really was. He saw fights, arguments, and people breaking down in tears. He heard stories from other inmates that chilled him. Many of them were in for serious crimes. Some had nothing to lose. Rick tried to stay quiet, to not attract too much attention, but it was hard. Some inmates wanted to talk to him because he was famous. Others didn't like him for the same reason. He kept his head down. He followed the rules, but inside he was struggling. This was not a life he was prepared for. Every day felt long and heavy. Every minute reminded him of how far he had fallen from the life he once had. He began to think about all the moments he had taken for granted. Simple things, like walking outside, talking freely, sleeping in his own bed, they now felt like a distant dream. Rick started writing in a small notebook he was allowed to have. He didn't share his thoughts with others, but he needed some way to release the emotions he was feeling. The pages were filled with questions, memories, and fears. He wrote about his family, his regrets, and the people he missed. Sometimes he just wrote the same word over and over again. Why? The guards watched him closely. They knew who he was. Some treated him normally. Others were curious. A few even asked him about the show. But no one made his life easier. In fact, some were even stricter with him to show that he wasn't special in here. That was the hardest part. Losing the identity he had built for so many years. In prison, Rick Harrison was not a TV star. He was just another name on the list. Even though he tried to stay calm, there were moments when Rick lost hope. He missed his shop, his family, and the freedom he had once enjoyed. He wondered if he would ever walk out of this place the same man. Would he be stronger or more broken? Would people wait for his return or forget about him? He also started to think about his past. Was there something he should have done differently? Were there signs that he had ignored? Prison gives a lot of time to think, and Rick was using every moment to replay his life. He thought about every deal he made, every choice, and every time he could have taken a different path. Still, he didn't cry. At least not in front of anyone. But deep inside, Rick was carrying a pain that was growing heavier each day. He knew he couldn't show weakness, but he also knew he couldn't pretend everything was okay. It wasn't. And maybe it never would be again. As the days turned into weeks, the world outside kept talking. People were guessing, judging, and making up stories. But inside, Rick was just trying to survive each day. He didn't know what the future held. He only knew that his life had changed forever, and there was no going back. The days in prison do not move fast. Every minute feels long. Every hour feels like a heavy weight sitting on your shoulders. Rick Harrison quickly realized that life inside a cell is not just about surviving danger, it's also about surviving boredom, stress, and your own thoughts. The first few days had passed in shock and confusion, but now reality had fully settled in. This was his new life, and he had no choice but to live it. Each morning, Rick would wake up to the sound of loud doors opening and guards shouting. There was no alarm clock, no soft light coming through a bedroom window, just noise and control. He had to follow the same routine every day. Wake up, eat, wait, do chores. Try to stay invisible, and try to keep his emotions hidden from others. He didn't want to look weak. But inside he was hurting. There were moments when Rick just sat on his hard bed, staring at the wall. Time moved slow. He had already counted every line in the bricks, already memorized the cracks in the floor. He often thought about his pawn shop. What was happening there? Were his sons managing it well? Were people still visiting, or were they turning away from the name Harrison now? In prison you don't get many choices. The food you eat, the clothes you wear when you sleep, when you wake up, it's all decided for you. Rick was used to being in control. He ran a successful business, made quick decisions, and always had a plan. But in here, he had no power. If the guards were angry, he had to deal with it. If an inmate got aggressive, he had to stay calm. He could not act like a boss here. He was just another prisoner trying to make it through the day. The food was always the same: dry bread, watery soup, sometimes beans or a piece of meat. There was no flavor, no choice, and no comfort. Rick ate it in silence. He didn't talk much to the other inmates. Some tried to get close to him, mostly because he was famous, but Rick didn't trust anyone. He didn't know who was being real and who just wanted a story to share. There were times when he felt like people were watching him more than others. Whispers followed him in the hallways. Inmates stared too long. It wasn't always violent, but it wasn't peaceful either. He had to stay alert. One wrong move, one misunderstood word, and things could go bad fast. Rick knew that not everyone inside respected him. Some felt jealous. Others just didn't like the idea of a TV star being around them. That tension followed him everywhere. At night, sleep didn't come easy. The thin mattress was uncomfortable, the lights were too bright, and the noise never really stopped. Rick often laid there with his eyes open, thinking about the world outside. He missed small things: coffee in the morning, the sound of customers walking through the pawn shop door, even the simple act of driving his car. It's strange how things that once seemed normal become the things you miss the most when they're taken away. Rick started reading whatever he could get his hands on. Old books, magazines, even newspapers. He wanted to keep his mind busy, but sometimes the words on the page just faded away, and his thoughts took over. He thought about his childhood, his father, the early days of building the business. He remembered the pressure he always felt to succeed, to keep things running, to always stay strong for everyone around him. Now he couldn't fix anything. He couldn't help anyone. And that helpless feeling was the hardest part of all. Some of the prison staff treated him like any other inmate. Others gave him looks, some curious, some unfriendly. A few guards tried to talk to him about Pawn Stars, asking if some of the scenes were real or staged. Rick didn't say much. He didn't feel like a TV personality anymore. He felt more like a ghost of who he used to be. Inmates came and went. Some were released, some were moved. Rick started to notice patterns. He could tell who was dangerous, who was depressed, and who just wanted to be left alone. He kept to himself, but inside he was studying the people around him. It was a habit from years of reading people in business. That skill now helped him stay safe. He had heard of things that could happen in prison: fights, threats, trouble, and though nothing major had happened to him yet, the fear was always there. It hung in the air, heavy and cold. Every time someone walked too close, or stared too long, Rick's heart beat a little faster. He didn't want to end up in a dangerous situation. He knew one mistake could cost him more than just time. There were also moments of strange peace. Once in a while, Rick would find a quiet corner and just sit. No one bothering him. No noise. Just stillness. It was in those moments that he thought the most, about the people who still cared about him. About the people he might have hurt without knowing, and about what kind of man he wanted to be when he got out. If he ever did, he had no idea how the world outside saw him now. Was he forgotten? Was he hated? Or were there still people waiting to hear his side of the story? He hoped someone still believed in him. That thought kept him going. That small hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of his story. Rick knew he had to stay strong. He told himself every day, this is temporary. You can get through it, But deep inside, he wasn't sure how long he could hold on. Prison changes a man, and Rick could feel those changes happening, slowly, deeply, in ways he couldn't fully explain. It had been a few weeks now, but for Rick Harrison, every day in prison still felt unreal. There were moments when he thought he would wake up and find himself back in his bed, maybe in his home or inside the office of his pawn shop. But every morning proved him wrong. The loud sound of the cell door, the voices of guards, the noise of footsteps in the hallway, these were now his new alarms. This was not a bad dream. It was real, and it wasn't ending anytime soon. Rick was slowly learning how to survive here, but that didn't mean it got any easier. His body might have adjusted to the cold walls and hard bed, but his mind was still trying to understand it all. He had so many questions. What did people on the outside think of him now? Was his reputation completely gone? Would he ever be trusted again? One of the hardest parts for Rick was the silence. Not just the quiet of the prison at night, but the silence from the outside world. Letters were rare. Visits were not promised. The people he thought would support him had gone quiet. It was like the fame that once gave him so much attention had now become a shadow. He was no longer the man in charge. He was no longer behind the counter making deals. He was now just a forgotten name on an old episode. There was a strange pain that came from feeling forgotten. Rick tried to act strong, but inside he was breaking a little each day. The loneliness felt deeper than any pain he had known before. He thought about the times he had people around him, laughing, working, living life with him. Now he was surrounded by strangers and thick walls that didn't care how famous he once was. One night, something unexpected happened. Rick was called out of his cell for a short meeting. He didn't know what it was about. His heart beat fast. Was it bad news? Was someone hurt? Was he being moved? A guard walked him through a long hallway and into a small office room. Inside was a person who said they were doing a check on Rick's mental health. It was standard, they said, especially for high-profile inmates. Rick sat quietly at first, unsure of what to say, but slowly he started to talk. Not everything, but enough to make the person understand that he was not doing well. He wasn't angry or violent, just lost. He said he felt like he had lost everything. His name, his future, and his reason to keep going. The person listened and nodded, giving him space to be honest. That talk stayed with Rick. It didn't fix anything, but it made him think. Maybe he had been carrying everything alone for too long. Maybe he needed to face some truths he had been avoiding, not just about prison, but about who he had become over the years. He remembered how much pride he had taken in being a strong, confident man. Always ready with answers, always in control, but now he had none of those things. And maybe that was why this place hurt so much. It took away all the parts of him he thought made him powerful. As the days passed, Rick started noticing others around him differently. He saw men who had been inside for years, who never got visitors, who had no one waiting for them outside. He saw people who had made mistakes and had been forgotten by the world. And for the first time, Rick felt like he understood what it meant to be truly alone. But something else began to happen too. Even in that dark place, he started to feel small moments of connection. A short conversation in the cafeteria, a quiet nod from another inmate, a guard who gave a little respect. It wasn't friendship, not really. But it was something. And that something helped Rick hold on just a little longer. He started writing again. This time it wasn't just notes or thoughts. He began writing letters to himself. Long letters, where he told the truth about how he was feeling. He wrote about regrets, about fame, about the things he missed. He even wrote about the fear that maybe he had become so used to attention that he didn't know who he really was without it. He didn't plan to show these letters to anyone. But writing them helped. It gave him a way to release the weight he was carrying. Each word was like a breath, each page like a small step forward. Sometimes he thought about what would happen when he finally got out. Would people believe his side of the story? Would the media twist his truth again? Would fans still care, or had the world already moved on? He wondered if he could go back to the pawn shop. Could he stand behind that counter again, smiling like nothing happened? Could he face customers knowing they had seen his lowest moments? He didn't know, but he hoped he would get the chance to try. At night, when the noise of the prison faded, Rick often looked up at the small window in his cell. It was too high to see anything clearly, but sometimes a bit of moonlight would pass through. It reminded him that the outside world still existed. that somewhere life was going on. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a place for him in it. Even though he felt broken, Rick wasn't giving up. He told himself that this pain had to mean something. That this part of his story, no matter how dark, wasn't the end. He was still alive. He was still thinking, still writing, still hoping. And sometimes that was enough. Something had changed in Rick Harrison. The days were still heavy, the walls still cold, and the silence still deep, but his eyes had a different kind of look now. It was the kind of look that comes when a man stops fighting what he cannot control and starts thinking about what he still can. Rick had faced the worst parts of himself in the dark, and now he was learning to sit with those feelings instead of running from them. He was still in the same cell, still wearing the same clothes, still eating the same food, but now each moment was no longer just about surviving the day. He was trying to understand what life was trying to teach him. Why had this happened? Was it all just bad luck? Or was there something deeper that he had been blind to for years? One afternoon, while sweeping the hallway floor, Rick overheard a conversation between two other inmates. They were laughing about something from the outside world, something about a new episode of a reality show. Rick didn't say anything, but hearing them reminded him of a time when his own show had made people laugh, when his family's faces were on screens across the country. It stung a little, knowing that life outside was moving forward while he was stuck behind bars, but it also sparked a memory that brought a small smile to his face. He thought about the early days of Pawn Stars, when it was all new and exciting, when fans would line up outside the store and take pictures. When people came in with weird items and he would talk about history like it was a storybook. Those were moments filled with energy and fun. But now looking back, he wondered, was he really happy then? Or was he just busy enough to ignore the things he didn't want to face? Rick had always been proud of his knowledge, his business sense, his ability to read people. But in prison, none of that mattered. No one cared if he knew the value of an old coin or a rare guitar. No one was impressed by his fame. And strangely, that gave him a kind of peace. For the first time in years, he didn't have to perform. He didn't have to be TV Rick. He could just be Rick, tired, confused, still trying to figure out who he was without the lights and cameras. He began noticing small things more. The sound of someone's quiet laughter during dinner. The way sunlight fell through the bars for just a few minutes in the afternoon. The feel of the paper when he wrote his thoughts down at night. These little moments felt more real than anything he had experienced in a long time. He realized that in the outside world, he had been so busy chasing success that he had stopped noticing the simple things. One day, Rick received a short letter. It was from an old friend, not someone famous, not a business partner, just someone who had known him before the show. The letter didn't say much, just a few words of support, but it touched Rick deeply. It reminded him that there were still people who remembered him for who he really was, not just for what he was on TV. That letter made him cry. Not loudly, not in front of anyone. Just quiet tears that rolled down his cheeks when he was alone in his cell. They weren't tears of sadness, but of release. He had been holding in so much pain, so much guilt and confusion, that the letter felt like a small hand reaching through the darkness to remind him he wasn't completely forgotten. Rick began writing back, and from that day on he started writing more letters, not just to the person who had written to him, but to others too. To his sons. To his staff at the pawn shop. To people he had lost touch with. He didn't know if the letters would reach them. He didn't even know if they wanted to hear from him. But he wrote anyway because it helped him feel human again. Each letter was like a piece of his old life being slowly put back together. He apologized where he needed to. He explained what he was feeling. He tried to show the side of him that people didn't always see. The quiet side, the thoughtful side, the broken, honest side. Rick also started helping a few younger inmates. Nothing big, just small advice here and there. How to handle stress. How to stay calm when things got tense. Some of them didn't care, but a few listened, and those few made him feel useful again, like maybe he still had something to offer. Inside he was still hurting, he still didn't know what his future looked like. But the difference now was that he had stopped pretending to have all the answers. For once he was okay with not knowing everything. He was learning to sit with the questions, to listen to his own heart instead of always trying to fix everything. There was still a long road ahead. Rick didn't know how the media would treat his story once he was out. He didn't know if his business could survive the damage to his name. He didn't know if his fans would come back, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never look at life the same way again. Sometimes the hardest places show us who we really are, and sometimes we have to lose everything to finally understand what matters most. Rick Harrison sat quietly on the edge of his small prison bed, staring at the wall in front of him. It looked the same as yesterday, and the day before that, but today something inside him felt different. There was a quiet storm building in his chest. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was something else, maybe a strange mix of hope and fear. He had heard a rumor that day. A guard mentioned it while talking to someone in the hallway. They said Rick's case might be reviewed again. Nothing was confirmed, but even the smallest chance gave him something to hold on to. That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind was full of thoughts, like waves crashing into each other. What if it was true? What if someone out there was finally listening? Could it really mean that his time behind bars might come to an end sooner than expected? Or was it just another false hope that would fade away like so many others? In the silence of the dark cell, Rick remembered a moment from the past. It was from years ago, back when Pawn Stars was at its peak. A fan had walked into the shop and said something that stuck with him. The fan had said, "You helped me learn more about history than any teacher ever did." Back then, Rick had smiled and thanked him. But now, sitting in this place far away from cameras and cheers, that memory hit differently. It made him wonder, could he still help someone? Even now, could he still matter in a world that had moved on? The next morning, he got a letter. It wasn't from a friend or family member. It was from a stranger. A young man who said he had grown up watching Pawn Stars, and that Rick had inspired him to start a small business of his own. The letter didn't mention the prison, or the news stories. It just talked about respect and appreciation. Rick read it over and over again. Each word felt like a piece of his lost identity coming back to him. That letter gave him an idea. Maybe it was time to stop just surviving and start doing something with the time he had. So he asked the prison librarian if he could help with books. It wasn't a big job, mostly sorting old books and putting them back on the shelves, but it gave him purpose. And slowly he started talking to other inmates about reading, about business, about life. Some listened, some didn't. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was trying again. One day, while helping in the library, Rick came across a book about personal growth. It talked about failure and second chances. It said that people don't change because they are forced to. They change because they finally see who they really are. That sentence stayed with him for days. He wrote it down and taped it to the wall of his cell. Every morning he looked at it and asked himself, "Am I ready to change?" Weeks passed. There was no news about the review of his case. The rumor faded, but Rick didn't stop what he had started. He kept reading, he kept writing, he kept talking to others. Something in him had shifted. He wasn't just waiting to be saved anymore. He was saving whatever was left inside him. Then one morning, something unexpected happened. A guard came to his cell with a serious look. Rick stood up, confused. The guard handed him a sealed envelope. It had an official stamp. Rick opened it with shaking hands. It was a notice. His case was in fact being looked at again. Not a promise, not a release date, but a chance. A real one. His heart beat faster. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a little excitement. But along with it came fear. What if things didn't go in his favor? What if people still believed he was guilty, even if he wasn't? What if freedom meant returning to a world that no longer had a place for him? He didn't sleep much that night. His mind kept showing him two different futures. In one he was out, standing in front of his shop, maybe older and quieter, but stronger. In the other, he was still here trying to find peace inside walls that would never open. He didn't know which one would come true, but he knew he had to be ready for either. In the days that followed, Rick began preparing himself, not just for possible freedom, but for what he wanted to do with it. He made a list, not of things he wanted to buy or places he wanted to go, but of people he wanted to talk to. Apologies he needed to make. Truths he needed to speak. He wanted to go back not as the man he once was, but as the man he had become. He knew that no one outside had seen this version of him, the quiet version, the reflective one. People had only seen the headlines, the news clips, the rumors, but he was more than that now. He had been humbled, broken and rebuilt. And while he couldn't undo the past, he could try to shape the future. Finally one afternoon, Rick stood in front of a panel. They asked questions, lots of them. About his actions, about his regrets, about what he had learned. He answered honestly. Not perfectly, but with heart. He didn't beg, he didn't fake anything. He simply told the truth. When it was over, he was taken back to his cell. The wait for a final decision had begun. And as he sat once again in that small space with the gray walls and metal bed, Rick felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Because no matter what happened next, he knew that he had done the hard work. He had faced himself. He had let go of the mask. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring.